And finally, we move on to the Egnater Tourmaster 4100. Now this is really is the flagship amp of Bruce Egnater's range. Sort of, I suppose what he was trying to achieve was a sort of Boogie Road King spec, but at a far more affordable price. What we basically have now is a 4-channel 100 watt all valve head. It's probably easier for us at the moment to start with the back panel, which would then obviously lead us onto the front panel and make it slightly more understandable. Starting with the back panel, if we go from left to right, what we now find is we have a variable switchable effects loop which now runs in series and in parallel, and we've obviously got send level and return level. What we also have is a feature on here whereby we have a loop assign function off the foot switch. Now if we go through the 4 settings of this, if we leave it set on to pedal, that means anything that we run through the send and return, we can do it on the fly. We can access any of those effects literally just by clicking the pedal down or taking it out as is required. If we now switch down to all on, this would basically mean that the effects loop foot switch on your front panel foot switch is ineffective and the loop is active all time, so therefore you'd have to access any of your effects via the individual effects themselves. Alternately, we can switch it on to clean stroke vintage 1 and 2 or overdrive 1 and 2, which basically means we can assign our effects loop off the foot switch to either of those 2 banks of channels. Now again, staying with the back panel, earlier when we talked about attenuation through the Rebel and the Renegade, of running it from 18 to 65 or from 1 to 30, what we now have is probably the most versatile range of power attenuation. Now first of all, we can run from full power, which is going to be full 100 watts, or half power at 50 watts. But now what we can do for each of our 4 foot switchable channels, we could run anywhere from on full power at 100 watts down to 20 watts, or if we go on half power, we'll run at 50 down to 10. So consequently what that means is, if we want to have that big, bright, glassy Fender sound, probably the best way to achieve that and to give us as much headroom as we want is maybe run at full power, run it through 100 watts, maybe also run clean and vintage. We could run that down at 50 watts. For our 2 drive channels now, obviously we have an option of either running our overdrive crunch channel maybe at 50 watts, run our solo channel at 20 watts, or obviously if we're on half power we can run at 25 or 10 watts. So what it affords us is ultimate versatility on our valve attenuation on this amp. Finally, on the back panel of our amplifier, we've now got, again, speaker emulated line out, which we can obviously adjust the level here. We've got hot and ground tube biasing. Moving on then, we've got obviously switchable 416 or 18 ohm wiring out for either running 4x12 or two 4x12s. Cool thing on this is the AC select, so wherever you are in the world you can select whatever mains output is applicable within that country rather than blowing your amp up. Okay, moving on to the front panel now. If we run left to right, obviously we have our overall master volume. We have density and presence. Now density and presence will effectively act pretty much like a global bright and tight, whereby we can add a little bit more top end or take it out, add a little bit more bottom end globally over the 4 channels. Now moving on to each of our 4 channels, we will have, let's go to the right hand side of the panel, we have clean 1 stroke vintage 1, clean 1, clean stroke vintage 2, overdrive 1, overdrive 2. So obviously this affords us the most amount of versatility used in conjunction with the back panel and the valve attenuation. This affords us the most versatility on all of these amps. So if we move on to our clean channel now, what we have on here, obviously we've got classic and modern switch for sort of classic glassy Fender tones through modern Marshall straight up to boogie type tones. So if we use the contour switch and keep the contour switch in, we could almost use the clean channel on a single coil pickup and make it kind of like move it anywhere from glassy Fender sound through an acoustic sound. Coming on to our clean vintage 2, again we can add a little more gain here, a little more crunch, move the contour round, give it that more sort of mid-scoop sound. Moving across to overdrive 1 and 2, effectively utilising the contour buttons, we could probably have our overdrive 1 if we wanted the typical British Marshall type crunch gain, and then we could foot switch that over, maybe using our valve attenuation as well, running it through 25 watts, and then bring the contour round, take out all those mid frequencies and get more of a sort of real saturated metal boogie sound. So you'll see the overall versatility of this affords you any tone from completely clean classic Fender warm sound right up to full-on thrash gain, very similar to sort of boogie sounds. Then finally, moving on to our foot switch, we have a straightforward 6-way foot switch where we will literally go from clean to vintage, clean vintage 2, overdrive 1, overdrive 2. Now depending on how we've assigned our effects loop at the back, we can access the effects loop or take it out as required, and then the last switch will access the reverb as required.